Welcome back, everyone.
Yes.
I know you're probably glued to the news today.
Right.
It's election day, and I'm sure you're eager to hear about the results. We are too.
Yeah, definitely.
But while we wait for all those numbers to come in, we thought we'd take a deep dive into some of the other big stories happening around the world today. We've got Germany's government. It's kind of teetering on the brink of collapse.
Yeah.
We've got some developments in Gaza, both hopeful and tragic, unfortunately. And North Korea's been, well, they've been up to their usual tricks, shall we say.
Right.
So buckle up. It's going to be a busy day in global news.
Lots to talk about.
Let's jump right in. Let's start with the U.S. presidential election.
Okay.
Today is Election Day, as we said, and it's a historic one, wouldn't you say?
It is, yeah.
Voters are choosing between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris.
Wow.
Can you believe it's come to this? I mean, a Trump-Harris rematch? Who would have predicted that a few years ago?
I know, right? It's pretty wild to see how the political landscape has changed.
And you know what? We actually already have some early results. Dixville Notch, New Hampshire. They're always the first to vote in every election.
Right.
They just reported a tie.
A tie.
3 votes for Trump, 3 votes for Harris.
Wow. Right out of the gate, it's a dead heat.
Talk about a nail-biter.
Yeah.
But of course, Dixville Notch is just a tiny, tiny sliver of the electorate.
Yeah, just a handful of votes.
So, as the results start pouring in from across the country, how should we be interpreting these early numbers? I mean, we always hear about how early leads can be deceiving.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
It's important to understand that early leads can be very deceiving, and the way different states report their votes can create a really distorted picture early on.
Okay, so break that down for us. What do you mean?
So some states count mail-in ballots first, which, they tend to favor Democrats, while other states prioritize election day votes, which are usually more favorable to Republicans.
Right.
This can lead to what we call the blue mirage or the red mirage.
Ah, yes, those mirages. We saw this happen in the 2022 Senate races, right?
Exactly. Remember the Rubio-Demings race in Florida?
Oh, yeah.
Early on, it looked like Demings was heading for a victory.
It did, yeah.
The initial vote tallies, which included a large chunk of mail-in ballots, showed her with a significant lead.
Right.
But as the election day votes were counted, Rubio steadily gained ground and ultimately won. That's a classic example of the blue mirage, an early lead for Democrats that evaporates as more Republican-leaning election day votes are tallied.
Though the red mirage would be the opposite, right? A Republican candidate with a strong early lead that shrinks as more Democratic-leaning mail-in ballots are counted.
Precisely.
Okay, got it. So we need to keep this in mind as we watch the results tonight.
Absolutely.
Don't get too excited or too discouraged by those early numbers.
Right, exactly.
The key is to understand how each state reports its votes and wait for a more comprehensive picture to emerge.
It's like putting together a puzzle. You need all the pieces before you can see the full picture.
That's a great analogy. And speaking of getting the full picture, I think it's worth mentioning that we're fortunate to have the Associated Press calling these elections. They've been doing it since 1848, and their process is incredibly thorough.
They have thousands of people across the country feeding them results from local precincts, and a whole team dedicated to verifying those results and ensuring accuracy.
Yeah, the huge operation.
And their commitment to nonpartisan, fact-based reporting is crucial, especially in today's environment where misinformation spreads so easily.
Absolutely. They're a trusted source of information helping us make sense of this oftentimes very chaotic process.
Exactly. So while we wait for those election updates, let's shift gears for a bit and head over to Europe. Things are getting pretty tense in Germany.
Oh, yeah.
The ruling coalition is on the verge of collapse.
Right. The coalition, that's the Social Democratic Party, the Greens, and the Free Democratic Party, right?
That's right.
And they've been butting heads over economic and budget policies, haven't they?
They have, yeah. The tension has been building for a while now. Germany's economy is facing some significant challenges, including, well, the threat of a recession, high inflation,
Right.
rising energy costs, and they're facing a substantial funding gap in their 2025 budget.
Oh, wow. So they're really feeling the squeeze.
Yeah, and the three parties have very different ideas about how to address these issues. That's where the friction is coming from.
And didn't Finance Minister Christian Lindner, a member of the FDP, recently present an economic revival paper.
He did, yes.
And that seems to have really thrown a wrench into the works.
It has. It sparked a lot of criticism from the SPD and the Greens.
What's the issue with the paper?
Well, Linder's paper, while intended to stimulate the economy and address the budget shortfall,
Right.
has been criticized for being too focused on tax cuts and austerity measures, which the SPD and the Greens believe will disproportionately hurt the most vulnerable.
Ah, so it's a classic clash of ideologies, different visions for how to steer Germany through these economic headwinds.
Exactly.
So where does this leave the coalition?
It's hard to say. They might be able to hammer out a compromise, but it's looking increasingly likely that the FDP might walk out.
And if that happens?
Well, if that happens, it could trigger snap elections, which would just add more uncertainty to an already volatile global landscape.
Wow. So Germany is definitely a situation to watch closely.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now let's turn our attention to a more humanitarian crisis,
Mm-hmm.
the situation in Gaza.
Mm.
Amidst all the conflict and challenges there, we see a glimmer of hope, the resumption of the polio vaccination campaign.
It's a testament to the resilience of those public health workers
Yeah,
and the global effort to eradicate this disease.
absolutely. They're trying to protect children in North Gaza,
Right.
where the first case of polio in 25 years was recorded back in August. But this campaign is facing some incredible hurdles.
It was initially postponed in October due to the Israeli bombardments, and now with mass displacement and limited access to certain areas, it's estimated that around 15,000 children might not receive the vaccination.
That's heartbreaking.
It is.
And then, adding to the tragedy, there are reports that the Sheikh Radwan clinic in Gaza City was struck, injuring several people, including children.
Oh, no.
Families were taking their children to this clinic for vaccinations when it was hit.
That's just awful.
It just underscores the vulnerability of civilians in this conflict.
It really does. It's a stark contrast, the hope represented by the vaccination campaign
Right.
and then this grim reality of the conflict.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that peace and stability are so precious and so fragile.
Yes, very much so.
And speaking of fragile, we have to address another tragedy that's unfolded in Gaza.
Yes, the airstrike.
An Israeli airstrike in northern Gaza has killed at least 20 Palestinians, mostly women and children.
Oh, that's terrible.
They were sheltering in a home when it was hit. Israel has stated that they were targeting a weapons storage facility and that they took measures to avoid civilian casualties. But the outcome is just tragic.
It really highlights the complexities of this conflict and the devastating human cost.
It does. The death toll, the hostage situation, the mass displacement, particularly in the north, with thousands fleeing to Gaza City.
It's a dire situation.
And then there's the surrender or starve plan that's being discussed.
Right.
Even though Israel denies implementing such a plan, it adds another layer of concern.
Imagine being told to leave your home knowing that aid would be cut off
Exactly.
and that anyone remaining would be considered a combatant.
It's chilling.
Yeah.
And on that note, let's move on to another potential flashpoint. North Korea. Just hours before the U.S. election kicked off, they decided to fire off several short-range ballistic missiles into the sea.
Well, that's not surprising, is it? They seem to like to make their presence known.
It does seem like they're trying to flex their muscles on the world stage, maybe even trying to influence the outcome of the U.S. election, although that's hard to say for sure.
It's certainly a possibility. They have a history of using provocations like this to get attention and extract concessions.
Right, and this comes after their recent test of the Hwasong-19.
Their new ICBM.
Yes, the one designed to reach the U.S. mainland. That was a significant development, wouldn't you say?
It was. It shows that they're continuing to advance their missile program despite all the sanctions and condemnation.
So what do you make of the timing of these launches, just hours before the U.S. election? Coincidence? Or a deliberate message?
Hard to say for sure, but the timing is certainly interesting.
The provocative even?
It could be a way of trying to influence the election, so discord, test the waters with the new administration.
Right, like they're saying, hey, we're still here and we're not going away.
Exactly. It's a reminder that they remain a significant security challenge no matter who wins the election.
And with those reports of potential technology transfer from Russia to North Korea, possibly in exchange for North Korean troops joining the fight in Ukraine, the situation becomes even more concerning, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Because if North Korea gets its hands on more advanced military technology from Russia, it could really shake things up in the region.
It would definitely enhance their capabilities and pose a greater threat to stability.
So it's a dangerous game they're playing, pushing the boundaries and testing the limits.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder what Kim Jong-un's endgame is.
Exactly.
It'll be interesting and a bit unnerving to see how this all plays out.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground already.
Mm.
We've got the U.S. election, the political turmoil in Germany, the conflict in Gaza, and the provocations of North Korea. It's a lot to take in, but I think it highlights something really important: how interconnected our world is.
It's true. These events, they all influence each other in complex ways.
Exactly. So let's take a moment to recap what we've learned so far, because I know your head must be spinning with all this information.
A quick recap would be helpful.
Right, so starting with the U.S. presidential election, it's election day.
Right.
We've got those first votes in from Dixville Notch, showing a tie between Trump and Harris.
A tie.
But remember, folks, early leads can be deceiving.
It can be very deceiving.
And we need to understand how different states report their votes to avoid those blue or red mirages.
Absolutely. Those mirages can really throw people off.
They can. And while we wait for the rest of those election results to come in, we've taken a look at some other key events happening around the world that are likely to have a big impact.
Yeah, events that could really shape the future in ways we can't even predict yet.
So let's dive back into those one by one and see what we can learn.
Sounds good.
Okay, let's go back to Germany for a minute.
Yeah.
We were talking about those tensions within the ruling coalition.
Right.
Can you give us a little more context on the economic challenges they're facing? What's at the heart of all this friction?
Well, like many countries around the world, Germany is dealing with a number of economic headwinds right now. There's a looming threat of a recession, fueled by high inflation, rising energy costs.
Right.
And they're also facing a pretty substantial funding gap in their 2025 budget.
How big are we talking?
Billions of euros.
Wow, that's a serious shortfall.
It is, yeah.
And I imagine those economic woes are putting a lot of pressure on this coalition government.
Absolutely. The three parties, the SPD, the Greens, and the FDP, they have very different ideas about how to navigate these challenges.
Right, you've got the Social Democrats who I imagine want to spend more to stimulate the economy.
Yeah, they're generally advocating for more government spending to stimulate the economy and protect social programs.
And the Greens, I'm guessing they're focused on climate change mitigation and renewable energy.
That's right. They're prioritizing investments in those areas.
And then you have the Free Democrats, the FDP. They're the fiscal conservatives, right? They want to cut spending and taxes.
Exactly. They're pushing for fiscal conservatism, tax cuts, and a reduction in government spending.
So it's a classic clash of ideologies.
It is.
A battle between different visions for Germany's economic future.
Yeah, it's a tough situation.
And then you throw Finance Minister Lindner's controversial economic revival paper into the mix, which seems to have just made things worse.
Oh, yeah, Lindner's paper, he's a member of the FDP, by the way.
Right.
He's proposed a series of measures that are aimed at, boosting economic growth and closing that budget gap, but they're not going over well with everyone.
What's in the paper?
Well, it includes significant tax cuts, deregulation, a freeze on public sector wages.
And the SPD and the Greens are not happy about this.
Not at all. They argue that Lindner's proposals are too focused on austerity measures. Measures that will disproportionately burden working-class families and undermine social programs. They believe it'll exacerbate inequality and weaken Germany's social safety net.
So how do you see this playing out? I mean, how are they going to resolve these fundamental disagreements?
Well, ideally, the three parties would find a way to compromise, maybe agree on a combination of spending cuts and targeted investments that address both the economic challenges and the social concerns.
But that sounds easier said than done.
It is, yeah. These are deeply held beliefs, entrenched political positions. The FDP in particular, they've been very adamant about their commitment to fiscal conservatism.
Right.
So if they're not willing to budge on some of their core principles, it could be very difficult to reach a compromise.
And if they can't find a way to work together?
Then the FDP might just walk out of the coalition.
And that would trigger a political crisis.
It could, yeah, potentially leading to snap elections.
Wow. So Germany's political future is hanging in the balance.
It is. It really is. And remember, Germany is the largest economy in the EU, so its political stability is crucial for the entire region.
So the stakes are high.
Very high.
All right, let's shift gears again. Let's go back to the Middle East, to Gaza. We were talking about the polio vaccination campaign earlier.
Right, a glimmer of hope amidst the conflict.
It's a story of resilience and hope in a very, very challenging situation.
Imagine trying to conduct a public health campaign in the middle of an active conflict zone.
Yeah.
It's incredibly difficult. You're dealing with bombardments, road closures, mass displacement.
Right, a lack of resources.
Exactly.
And yet, they're still pushing forward with this critical mission.
They understand how important it is to protect children from this debilitating disease.
It is a global priority to eradicate polio.
It is.
And it's inspiring to see them doing their part, even in the face of these immense challenges.
It really is.
It highlights that point we made earlier about how interconnected our world is. The fight against polio, it's a global effort.
It is.
It requires cooperation and solidarity.
Yes.
We can't afford to turn our backs on those in need, even in the midst of conflict.
We're all in this together.
And, it's also a reminder that even amidst the darkest of times, there are always those glimmers of hope, people working tirelessly to make the world a better place.
Absolutely there are.
You mentioned earlier that there was another story coming out of Gaza, something about a town called Nabatea.
Oh, yes, Nabatea.
What's happening there?
Well, it's in southern Lebanon, and it's become a refuge for thousands of Palestinians who are fleeing the violence in Gaza.
Wow, so they're crossing borders to escape the conflict.
They are.
And how are they being received in Nabatea?
Well, Nabatea is predominantly Shia Muslim,
Oh, yeah.
and they've really opened their arms to these displaced Palestinians, offering them food, shelter, medical care.
That's incredible.
It is. They're setting up makeshift camps, organizing relief efforts, providing whatever support they can.
Wow, that's a beautiful example of compassion and solidarity, transcending those religious and political divides.
It really is. It's a powerful reminder that even in the midst of all this conflict and division, there are people who choose kindness and empathy.
It's a much-needed dose of hope in these uncertain times.
It is. It really is. It shows that even in the darkest of circumstances, the human spirit can shine through.
Well said. Okay, we've explored the complexities of the U.S. election, the political drama in Germany, the resilience of hope in Gaza, and now this remarkable display of humanity in Nabatea.
It's been quite a journey.
It has. But before we wrap up, we need to circle back to North Korea and those missile launches.
Right. We can't ignore those provocations.
They raised some serious questions about Kim Jong-un's intentions and the potential implications for regional and global security.
Absolutely.
So let's dive into that next. What do you make of these missile tests? What message is Kim Jong-un trying to send?
Well, I think it's important to understand the context here.
Right.
North Korea has a long history of using these kinds of military provocations, to assert their power, to test the resolve of their adversaries, to try to extract concessions.
Right.
So these missile launches, they're really part of a pattern of escalating behavior that we've been observing for quite some time now.
And these launches come on the heels of their recent test of the Hwasong-19.
Right. Their new ICBM.
The one that's capable of reaching the U.S. mainland.
Yeah.
That's a significant development, wouldn't you say?
It is. It really is. It demonstrates that they're continuing to advance their ballistic missile program despite international sanctions and condemnation.
They're determined to develop a credible nuclear deterrent, one that can threaten the U.S. homeland.
It seems that way.
And what about the timing of these launches? I mean, just hours before the U.S. election.
Right.
Do you think that's a coincidence? Or is Kim Jong-un trying to send a message to the American people?
It's hard to say for sure, but the timing is certainly provocative. It could be a way of trying to influence the election outcome, sow discord and uncertainty, or maybe they're trying to test the waters with the new administration, whoever that may be.
Right. It's like they're saying, hey, we're still here and we're not going away.
Exactly. It's a reminder that North Korea remains a significant security challenge no matter who wins the election.
And then you add those reports of potential technology transfer from Russia to North Korea into the mix.
Yeah.
Possibly in exchange for North Korean troops joining the fight in Ukraine.
That's a concerning development.
If North Korea gets its hands on more advanced military technology from Russia, it could really change the game.
It could. It could significantly enhance their capabilities and pose an even greater threat to regional stability.
And it would also strengthen the ties between those two countries, Russia and North Korea. Right.
It would, yeah, creating a more formidable challenge to the international order.
So the stakes are high.
They are.
It seems like Kim Jong-un is playing a dangerous game here, pushing the boundaries, testing the limits of international tolerance.
He is. And it's going to be fascinating and a bit unnerving to see how this all plays out.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've explored the U.S. election, the political turmoil in Germany, the conflict in Gaza, and the provocations of North Korea.
It's been a whirlwind of information.
It has, but hopefully you're starting to see the connections, the threads that weave these seemingly disparate events together.
The world is a complex and interconnected place.
It is.
And it's important to understand these connections if we want to make sense of the challenges we face.
Absolutely. All right, before we wrap up, let's take a moment to synthesize what we've learned. Let's start with the U.S. election. What are the key takeaways for our listeners?
Well, it's election day, and the first votes are in, showing a tie in Dixville Notch.
A tie, can you believe it?
But as we discussed, those early numbers don't necessarily mean much.
Right, they can be very deceiving.
The key is to be patient and wait for more results to come in before jumping to any conclusions.
And to remember those mirages.
Yes, the blue and red mirages.
Understanding how different states report their votes is crucial if you want to avoid misinterpreting those early leads.
Exactly.
Now, what about Germany? What's the main takeaway from our discussion about their political situation?
Well, Germany is facing some serious economic challenges, and those challenges are putting a lot of strain on the ruling coalition government.
Right, we've got those three parties.
The SPD, the Greens, and the FDP.
All with very different ideas about how to steer the country through these turbulent times.
It's creating a lot of tension,
It is.
and there is a real possibility that the coalition could collapse, leading to snap elections, which would add even more uncertainty to the mix.
And that uncertainty would have ripple effects across Europe.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's move on to Gaza. What were some of the key insights that emerged from our conversation about the situation there?
Well, despite the ongoing conflict and the immense challenges facing the people of Gaza,
Yeah,
there are still glimmers of hope.
like that polio vaccination campaign.
Exactly. The fact that they're continuing that campaign, even amidst all the chaos and destruction, is truly inspiring.
And the compassion shown by the people of Nabati.
Yes, the way they've welcomed those Palestinian refugees.
It's a powerful reminder that humanity can prevail, even in the darkest of circumstances.
It really is.
Now, lastly, what about North Korea? What's the main message our listeners should take away from our discussion about their recent actions?
Well, North Korea's missile launches are a clear sign that they're not backing down.
Yeah,
They're continuing to develop their military capabilities.
despite international pressure.
Despite international pressure and the timing of these launches right before the U.S. election.
Right.
It's a deliberate provocation.
It is.
They're trying to send a message, remind the world that they're a force to be reckoned with.
And that they're not going away anytime soon.
Exactly.
So we've covered a lot of ground today. It's been a whirlwind tour of global events, but I think it's clear that we're living in a very complex and interconnected world.
We are.
And the events we've discussed today, they're all intertwined in ways that we may not even fully understand yet.
They are. And the choices we make, both individually and collectively, will determine how these events unfold and ultimately shape the future.
So stay informed, stay engaged, stay curious.
And never lose hope.
Well said. And that brings us to the end of our deep dive for today. We hope you found it informative and thought-provoking. We'll be back soon with another exploration of a fascinating topic, so stay tuned. Until then, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those minds engaged.
And don't forget to vote.
Yes, absolutely. Don't forget to vote. If you're eligible, of course. All right, folks, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Okay, so we've talked about a lot today, kind of a whirlwind, right?
Yeah.
The U.S. presidential election, Germany, Gaza, North Korea.
A lot going on.
But I think if there's one big takeaway from all of this,
Mm-hmm.
it's that our world, it's really interconnected.
It is, yeah.
What happens in one corner of the world, it can have a huge impact on everything else that's going on. The
Absolutely.
U.S. election, the situation in Ukraine, the conflict in Gaza, the politics in Germany, North Korea's actions. They're all connected in some way, right?
They are. It's like a complex web of events and actors, and sometimes it's hard to see how it all fits together.
Yeah, it can be overwhelming,
It can be.
but I think it's important to try to make sense of it all, to understand those connections, even if they're not always obvious.
Right, because those connections, they can help us understand why things are happening the way they are.
Yeah, it's all part of a bigger picture.
Exactly.
So what does this mean for our listeners? What should they be thinking about as they process all this information?
I think the main takeaway is that we're living in a time of great uncertainty, but it's also a time of immense opportunity.
Right, because our choices, our actions, they can really make a difference.
They can.
Whether it's voting in an election
Mm-hmm.
or speaking out against injustice
Right.
or simply staying informed about what's happening in the world around us,
All of those things matter.
they do. So
Yeah.
stay informed, stay engaged, and stay curious.
Yeah, right. Absolutely.
The world needs your active participation now more than ever.
I couldn't agree more.
And remember, even when things seem dark and overwhelming,
Mm-hmm.
there are always those glimmers of hope. People who are working to make the world a better place.
Yeah, never forget that.
So that wraps up our deep dive for today. We hope you found it insightful and thought-provoking. We'll be back soon with another exploration of a fascinating topic, so stay tuned. Until then, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those minds engaged.
And don't forget to vote if you haven't already.
Yes, absolutely. All right, folks, thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time. If you enjoy our daily news podcast and want to stay updated, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on the bell for notifications. Your support really helps us bring you the latest news every day. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you in the next episode.